Imagine holding a beautiful, leather-bound first folio edition of Shakespeare's Hamlet.
Oh, right. An absolute treasure.
Exactly. And you hand it to someone and you ask them to explain the tragic meaning of the play. The heartbreak, the hesitation, the madness of the Prince of Denmark.
The actual substance of the work.
Spot on. But instead of reading the words, they take the book into a laboratory. They chemically analyze the ink on the pages.
Right.
They map out every single molecule of carbon and iron in that ink. They measure the exact thickness of the paper, the binding glue, the thread.
Into the microscopic level.
Yeah, exactly. And then they hand you this massive spreadsheet of chemical compounds and say, there, that is the meaning of Hamlet.
Oh, wow. That is, it's completely missing the point, isn't it?
Entirely. They have mapped the physical reality flawlessly, but they have completely, totally missed the poetry.
And that chemical analysis of the ink, that is exactly what happens when clinical psychiatry falls into the trap of what we call neurocentrism.
Neurocentrism.
Yes. It is this highly seductive, rapidly growing trend in modern medicine to try and explain all complex human behavior simply by mapping the biological circuits of the brain.
Right.
The assumption is that once we map the neurons, the synapses, and the neurotransmitters, we have, fully explained the human being.
But the subjective experience of the patient, the actual poetry of their life, is treated as secondary.
Or even completely irrelevant, yeah.
Which is exactly why we are going deep into this topic today.
Huh?
For those of you listening, whether you are a psychiatry trainee, a registrar on the wards, or a clinician seeking to just, strengthen your mental models.
The goal here isn't to just recite textbook facts.
Exactly. We are looking at the foundational epistemology of the field. How do you actually weigh the physical biology of a brain against the lived reality of a mind?
We need a grounding principle to start navigating this, I think.
Right. So let's set that anchor. What is the foundational principle here?
The foundational anchor we have to establish before we look at a single scan or a single behavioral study is this. Psychiatry is the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact.
Brain, mind, and experience.
Exactly. And crucially, how that process can go wrong. If you remove any one of those three pillars, the entire clinical structure just collapses.
So we can't treat the brain while ignoring the mind.
No, nor can we treat the mind while ignoring the environment. It all has to integrate.
But the temptation to ignore the mind and just focus solely on the physical brain, it is overwhelming right now, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Neurocentrism devalues psychological explanations. It devalues environmental factors like familial chaos, trauma, or poverty.
But from a purely scientific standpoint, you can sort of understand the obsession.
You can, yeah. The physical organ itself is staggering. Roughly 85 billion neurons.
Which is just an incomprehensible number.
It is. More connections than there are stars in the Milky Way, and it generates the hard problem of consciousness.
Right, dealing with biological tissue that somehow produces the subjective feeling of being alive.
Exactly. And the brain is temporally and spatially closer to our behavior than, say, a complex social environment or a childhood trauma.
Because a traumatic event might happen 20 years prior.
Right, but the neuronal firing happens milliseconds before the action. So naturally, the brain feels like the most direct, actionable cause of human suffering.
But the prime impetus behind this current neurocentric enthusiasm, it isn't just an appreciation of anatomical complexity, is it?
No, not at all. It is driven heavily by the visual bias introduced by non-invasive functional neuroimaging.
fMRI scans.
Exactly.
The imagery is absolutely everywhere. You open a medical journal or even a mainstream newspaper, and you see those vibrant neon blotches of color lighting up on a black background.
They look so authoritative, don't they?
They really do. They have basically replaced the old planetary model of the atom as the ultimate symbol of hard science.
And there's an evolutionary reason we fall for it. Our primate ancestors survived primarily by trusting their vision.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The major threats, the sources of food, they were apprehended visually. This survival advantage gave rise to an automatic, reflexive cognitive bias.
So if we see it, we believe it's the ultimate truth.
Spot on. We inherently believe the physical world is exactly as our eyes perceive it to be. Psychologists and philosophers refer to this as naive realism.
Naive realism. It's the exact same misplaced faith that made humanity believe the sun revolved around the earth for thousands of years.
Yes, people looked up at the sky and trusted their raw visual impressions.
And when Galileo proposed the heliocentric universe, he actually noted that his model committed a, quote, rape upon the senses.
Because it defied what human eyes were seeing every single day.
Right. So taking the brightly colored patterns on an fMRI scan and trusting them to reveal nuanced, subjective mental contents.
It is a modern manifestation of that exact same bias.
Fascinating.
The neuroethics researcher Eric Racine coined a term for this specific clinical vulnerability. He calls it neurorealism.
Neurorealism. Let's unpack that.
It is the fallacious propensity to regard brain images as inherently more valid or more real than other types of behavioral data.
So a scan is seen as better evidence than what the patient is actually saying.
Exactly. The source material features a quote from a neuroeconomist named Paul Zak that perfectly captures this neurorealist mindset.
What does he say?
He argues that a brain scan lets him embrace concepts like morality or love or compassion in a, quote, non-squishy way.
A non-squishy way.
Wow. The implication being that a patient's self-reported feelings or behaviors are squishy, but a blood flow measurement is concrete proof.
We see this with trauma, too. People will point to a scan and say, look, this proves PTSD isn't a made-up disorder.
Which is so frustrating from a clinical perspective.
Right, because do we really need an fMRI to prove someone has PTSD or is in love?
Of course not. We diagnose PTSD behaviorally. The diagnostic criteria do not require an fMRI.
The patient's history, their nightmares, their hyperarousal, that is the reality.
Exactly. The brain scan is simply a biological correlate of that reality. It is not the defining reality itself.
So what's the danger here? If the scan just confirmed what we already know?
The danger of neurorealism is that it subtly shifts the focus of treatment away from the patient's lived experience and towards correcting a mechanical deficit.
Ah, I see.
Which requires us to clarify the distinction between the brain and the mind.
Let's define the levels of analysis here. Mental life obviously arises from brain activity. A patient with a completely dead brain has no mind.
Correct. But we cannot treat them as interchangeable terms.
So how do we separate them?
The brain refers to the mechanisms, the neurons, the proteins, the genes, the action potentials that enable perception and cognition.
The hardware.
Essentially, yes. The mind refers to the subjective experiences, the awareness, the search for meaning, the desires, the guilt.
So modern psychiatry relies on a specific philosophical framework for this, right?
It does. It's called property dualism.
Okay, property dualism, not substance dualism.
Right. Almost no one believes in Cartesian substance dualism anymore. The idea that the mind and brain are physically separate substances.
The old ghost in the machine idea.
Exactly. Instead, property dualism says the brain and the mind are materially the same entity, but they represent different levels of description.
And therefore, they possess completely different emergent properties.
Spot on.
To use a very rough analogy, you cannot use the physical rules of cellular biology to predict macroeconomic shifts.
That's a great way to put it.
Even though macroeconomics is driven by human beings made of cells, the properties that emerge at the economic level are entirely different from the properties at the cellular level.
And ignoring those emergent properties leads to what we call radical eliminative reductionism.
That sounds intense. What is eliminative reductionism?
It's the insistence that the psychological level of analysis will eventually be completely eliminated.
Erased entirely.
Yes. Proponents of this view believe that one day we will explain everything mental solely by looking at material physics and chemistry.
So we'd stop using words like sadness or hope.
Exactly. We'd replace them entirely with descriptions of serotonin receptor densities and electrical potentials.
Which takes us right back to the Hamlet metaphor. You eliminate the poetry to focus on the ink.
Precisely. But practically speaking, on the ward, this theoretical debate has serious consequences.
How so?
It leads to what our sources call the treatment etiology fallacy.
The treatment etiology fallacy. Okay, break that down for me.
It's the assumption that if a disorder has a biological cause, an etiology, it inherently demands a biological cure.
Ah, but that's not always true.
Not at all. Consider major depressive disorder. It undeniably has biological and genetic roots. We can observe altered functioning in the limbic system.
Right, the biology is clear.
But that biological etiology does not dictate that pharmacotherapy is the only or even the most effective treatment.
So therapy works just as well.
Often better. Cognitive behavioral therapies, which operate entirely at the psychological level, are highly effective.
Without the physical side effects of medication.
Exactly. And they often show superior prevention of future episodes compared to medication alone. A biological mechanism does not mandate a biological intervention.
That mechanistic view of the brain, though, it gets tested most severely when we look at substance dependence, doesn't it?
Well, without a doubt. Addiction is where neurocentrism is most heavily debated.
Over the last decade or so, the National Institute on Drug Abuse NED has heavily promoted a highly specific model.
Yes, defining addiction fundamentally as a chronic and relapsing brain disease.
Now, we have to acknowledge the neurobiological truth underpinning that definition.
We do. Repeated, heavy use of heroin, cocaine, or alcohol fundamentally alters neural circuits.
Prolonged exposure causes modifications in the pathways, mediating pleasure, motivation, memory, impulse inhibition, and executive planning.
These changes are completely observable and quantifiable.
I want to look closely at the mechanisms of craving, specifically cue-induced craving.
That's a crucial mechanism to understand.
Let's say a patient who is trying to maintain sobriety catches a whiff of cigarette smoke, or hears the clink of a glass, or simply drives past the corner where they used to buy drugs.
In that exact moment, they experience a sudden, intense rush of yearning, fueled by massive dopamine surges in the reward circuitry.
And we can actually see this on a scan, right?
Yes. Researchers have mapped this extensively by placing addicted individuals in an fMRI scanner and showing them videos of people handling drug paraphernalia.
Like a crack pipe or lines of cocaine.
Right, and the scans revealed the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala blooming with intense metabolic activity in response to those visual cues.
But the subjective experience for the patient,
Yeah.
it isn't pleasurable, is it?
No, not at all. It is an ambush. They describe feeling blindsided, tense, and confused because this rush of desire seems to bypass their conscious thought completely.
The brain changes are undeniable. But the leap from observing an altered reward circuit to medically categorizing all addiction as a purely chronic brain disease, that seems flawed.
It is flawed. And the clinical consequences of that label are profound.
What's the main consequence?
The primary consequence is the medicalization of addiction, which initiates a desperate search for a purely pharmacological solution.
A magic bullet.
Exactly. If addiction is exclusively a brain disease, the logic dictates we need a chemical cure to fix the broken machinery.
But how successful has that pharmacology been?
Very mixed. Methadone and buprenorphine are cornerstones for opiate addiction, yet a significant percentage of patients in methadone clinics continue to use illicit substances.
And what about other drugs?
There is still no FDA-approved medication therapy for cocaine dependence. Cocaine vaccines that bind to the drug in the bloodstream have shown very poor promise for wide-scale clinical use.
What about things like antabuse?
Remdesivir, right. It induces severe vomiting if the patient consumes alcohol. But it suffers from massive compliance issues because the patient can simply choose to stop taking the pill.
In the source material, one neuroscientist compared addiction to pneumonia. They argued it is a neurological problem that allows for medical solutions, just as pneumonia is a lung problem.
Yeah, but that analogy collapses completely under scrutiny.
Because if a patient is comatose with severe pneumonia, I can administer intravenous antibiotics, and I can cure their lung infection while they are completely unconscious.
Their agency is not required for the cure.
Exactly. But you cannot cure a comatose addict.
You cannot, because addiction fundamentally requires human action. It is a behavioral condition centrally characterized by the persistent seeking and using of substances.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. Virtually no other disease model includes intentional, complex human actions as part of its core definition. To overcome an addiction, the individual has to actively engage in changing their patterns of thought, their environment, and their social interactions.
The pneumonia analogy strips the individual of their agency.
And ignores the operant behavior required to maintain the addiction.
This disconnect between the biological model and the lived reality of the patient brings to mind the old 1980s public service announcement.
Oh, the fried egg advert.
Yes, the "This is your brain on drugs" campaign featuring an egg frying in a sizzling pan.
Right. The fried egg myth implies that the addict's brain is constantly in a state of chaotic, involuntary compulsion.
It suggests that once the brain is altered, the person is nothing more than an automaton driven entirely by the drug.
But the clinical and observational reality contradicts that completely. There is a landmark 1969 study by criminologist Edward Preble and John J. Casey.
Titled, "Taking Care of Business: The Heroin User's Life on the Street."
That's the one. They conducted extensive ethnographic research and found something fascinating. Heroin users actually spend only a tiny fraction of their day intoxicated.
Really? Just a tiny fraction?
Yes, the rest of their day is spent functioning in the real world.
Hustling for money, avoiding the police, managing relationships.
Trying to secure housing, looking for employment. The level of executive function required to maintain a daily heroin habit on the street is actually quite high.
I'd never thought of it that way. It requires immense planning.
And delayed gratification and social manipulation. There is a surprising amount of lucid time in the daily life of an addict.
So the brain is not constantly sizzling in a pan.
No. The capacity for choice remains intact, even if the choices being made are heavily skewed toward acquiring the drug.
But that raises a massive paradox. How does the capacity for choice coexist with such devastating self-destruction?
The psychologist Gene Heyman framed this brilliantly.
What did he say?
He pointed out that we can easily imagine an addict choosing to get high on any given Tuesday without actively choosing to be an addict.
Right.
Yet choosing to get high every single day is exactly what makes one an addict.
It is the incremental arrival of an undesirable outcome. Nobody aspires to be an addict, but the daily choices accumulate into a devastating reality.
Exactly. In the early phases of substance use, the drug provides immense appeal euphoria, social lubrication, or relief from distress.
And over time.
As tolerance builds and the negative consequences accrue, lost income, ruined marriages, health crises, the drug retains its allure primarily because it blunts the psychic pain of those consequences and suppresses the physical withdrawal.
So the individual is constantly navigating conflicting motivations. They possess reasons to use, and they possess reasons not to use.
And eventually, for many, the psychological scale tips.
William S. Burroughs, who was deeply addicted to heroin for much of his life, described this tipping point as the naked lunch experience.
That's a brilliant term for it.
He defined it as a frozen moment when everyone sees exactly what is on the end of every fork.
A sudden, sharp flash of moral and self-reflective awareness.
Christopher Kennedy Lawford documented these experiences in a collection called Moments of Clarity.
Right. He compiled accounts from actors, musicians, and everyday patients describing this profound jolt to their self-image.
A mother looking at her neglected child and suddenly thinking, what kind of mother am I?
Or a patient standing in an alleyway realizing, my God, I almost robbed an innocent person for $20.
These are not the thoughts of a broken machine with a hijacked brain.
No, these are the highly complex thoughts of an active mind engaging in deep moral evaluation and narrative reassessment.
Which leads to a data point in our sources that profoundly challenges the standard clinical narrative.
The epidemiology data.
Yes. Quitting is actually the rule, not the exception.
Which is shocking to a lot of people.
The epidemiologic catchment area study, which surveyed 19,000 people, found that among individuals who were dependent on illicit drugs by age 24, roughly 75% reported zero drug symptoms by age 37.
That is a staggering number, and the National Comorbidity Survey corroborated this.
They found recovery rates around 77 to 86% among those reporting no substance problems in the year prior to the survey.
And most crucially, the vast majority of these individuals achieved remission without formal professional help or rehabilitation programs.
Wait, entirely on their own?
Yes. They simply aged out or made a conscious decision to stop.
But if the vast majority of people age out of addiction, why does the medical establishment, led by organizations like NIDA, continue to categorically define it as a permanent, chronic, and relapsing disease?
It does seem like a massive blind spot, doesn't it?
Why is the clinical view so heavily skewed toward pessimism?
The distortion is caused by a phenomenon statisticians Patricia and Jacob Cohen termed the clinician's illusion.
The clinician's illusion, how does that work?
Clinicians working in addiction medicine generally only encounter the 40 to 60% of patients who repeatedly relapse.
They see the hardest, most severely comorbid cases.
Exactly. The patients with co-occurring schizophrenia, severe trauma, or profound antisocial personality traits.
The people who quietly mature out of their addiction in their 30s, get a steady job, and raise a family, they do not show up in the clinic waiting room.
Right. So clinicians suffer from an availability heuristic. They mistakenly generalize the severe chronic subset of patients they treat every day to the entire epidemiological population of substance users.
The waiting room is a skewed sample of reality.
Spot on.
So if we want to understand how the majority of people actually quit, we have to look outside of neurobiology and examine behavioral economics.
Yes, specifically the concept of self-binding developed by the Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling. It is incredibly useful here.
Schelling used the classic metaphor of Odysseus tying himself to the mast of his ship.
Right. Odysseus knew that when his ship approached the sirens, their song would completely overwhelm his rational faculties.
He knew he would steer his ship into the rocks to reach them.
So while he was still in a lucid, rational state, He bound himself. He deliberately removed his future capacity for choice.
And recovering addicts utilize the exact same behavioral strategy to manage their environment.
They do. Our sources describe a teacher trying to maintain abstinence from cocaine who actively changed her classroom from powdery chalk to a whiteboard.
Just because the tactile sensation of the chalk dust was too strong a conditioned trigger.
Exactly. Then there is the example of an investment banker addicted to injecting speedballs. He forced himself to wear long-sleeve shirts in the summer to hide his inviting veins from his own sight.
Others employ companies to administer surprise urine tests and mandate that the results be sent directly to their employer or their spouse.
These patients are actively managing their environment because they recognize both their vulnerability and their agency.
They understand that their brain's reward circuitry will react strongly to cues, so they construct psychological and physical barriers.
Which demonstrates that the operant function of the behavior is still intact. Addiction is not an alien entity that invades the brain.
It serves a purpose.
The substance use serves a specific, deep emotional purpose for the individual.
Behavioral psychologists call it an operant function. The substance is doing work for the patient.
Caroline Knapp described her 20 years of severe alcoholism in her memoir, Drinking, a Love Story.
What did she say?
She wrote, "You drank to drown out fear, to dilute anxiety and doubt and self-loathing and painful memories."
She wasn't an automaton manipulated by a disease. She was actively medicating a painful psychological reality.
Exactly. And the screenwriter Jerry Stahl, detailing his heroin addiction, stated he was seeking the soothing hiss of oblivion.
The soothing hiss of oblivion.
Wow. He noted that his lifetime on the needle was spent altering the single, undeniable fact that to be alive means being conscious.
Then there is Lisa, a 37-year-old sex worker featured in an HBO documentary about addiction. She displays complete lucidity regarding her choices.
She does. She says, "Right now, I am in no position to go into recovery. I have money, drugs, business. I'm okay."
Most tellingly, she adds, "I always use for a reason. It's repressing what needs to be repressed."
It's repressing what needs to be repressed. If a clinician tells Lisa that she simply has a malfunctioning neural circuit in her ventral striatum, they are entirely missing the emotional logic of her addiction.
The strict neurocentric model has no vocabulary for persistent self-loathing, existential dread, or deep-seated trauma.
No, it reduces profound human suffering and intentional coping mechanisms to a mechanical glitch.
And the limitations of that mechanical model become starkly apparent when these theoretical and clinical debates enter the courtroom.
The intersection of neuroscience and the law is where the concept of neurocentrism is currently causing the most profound societal friction.
We are seeing this increasingly in capital defenses and probation hearings, aren't we?
Yes, defense attorneys bring an fMRI scan into the courtroom, project it onto a screen, point to an area of altered metabolic activity in the prefrontal cortex and argue, "My client's brain made him do it."
The physical machinery is broken. Therefore, he cannot be held legally responsible for his actions.
But that entire framing, me versus my brain, is a false dichotomy.
Because the law does not interact with brains. The law interacts with persons.
Exactly. The legal bedrock of criminal responsibility relies on the concept of mens rea, which translates to guilty mind.
Mens rea. It encompasses intent, knowledge, recklessness, or negligence.
It assumes a folk psychological model of human behavior where people have desires, beliefs, and the ability to act upon them.
So the law asks, did this individual act intentionally? Did they act rationally? Do they possess a reasonable degree of freedom of choice?
While neuroscience, conversely, provides a purely mechanical level of explanation, neurons do not possess intentions.
Synapses do not have aspirations, moral frameworks, or an understanding of past and future.
Attempting to seamlessly translate a mechanical brain scan into the intentional language of the law is fundamentally flawed.
Now, Professor Stephen Morse calls this the fundamental psycholegal error.
Yes, the fundamental psycholegal error.
It is the overwhelming temptation to equate the cause of a behavior with a legal excuse for that behavior.
It is the misguided assumption that if we can identify a distinct biological or genetic cause for a specific action, then the individual must be excused from responsibility.
But all human behavior is caused by biological antecedents.
Exactly. Every time a person reads a book, donates to charity, or commits an assault, there is a complex biological cascade occurring in their brain that caused the action.
The law does not excuse a defendant simply because their behavior had a physical cause.
The law excuses behavior only when a causal factor produces an impairment so severe that it entirely deprives the defendant of their rationality.
Lack of rationality is a legal excuse. Lack of biology is not.
Spot on.
How does this play out in legal precedent? There is a fascinating landmark case from 1966, Leroy Powell v. Texas.
The context here is vital. Powell was a chronic alcoholic who was convicted of public intoxication.
His defense attorney constructed an argument based entirely on the disease model, didn't he?
He did. The argument was that because Powell suffered from the disease of chronic alcoholism, he was completely powerless to control his drinking.
And therefore, fining him for public intoxication was unconstitutional, amounting to cruel and unusual punishment for having a disease.
A psychiatrist even took the stand and testified that Powell suffered from an irresistible compulsion.
The defense seemed solid based on the medical model of the time, but the entire narrative shifted when Powell himself took the witness stand.
Under cross-examination, the prosecution dug into the specific timeline of his day.
Powell admitted under oath that he had taken exactly one drink at 8 a.m. that morning.
When the prosecutor asked him why he stopped at a single drink rather than continuing to a state of severe intoxication, Powell replied that he knew he had to be sober for his trial that afternoon.
He understood that if he continued drinking, he would pass out, the police would arrest him, and he would face worse consequences.
He responded to an anticipated consequence.
He undoubtedly experienced intense craving, and his brain circuits were undeniably altered by years of heavy alcohol abuse. But the foreseeable consequence of missing his court appearance provided sufficient motivation for him to self-bind and stop drinking.
And the Supreme Court ultimately upheld his conviction, ruling that despite his disease, he clearly demonstrated the capacity for rational choice and the ability to conform his behavior to the law.
We see the exact same legal and medical tension 50 years later. In 2017, there was the highly publicized Massachusetts case of Julie Eldred.
Right. Eldred was a severe fentanyl addict who was placed on probation.
One of the conditions of her probation was that she remain drug-free. She subsequently tested positive for fentanyl.
The judge, facing a severe shortage of inpatient treatment beds and fearing she would fatally overdose if left on the street, temporarily ordered her to jail until a bed became available.
Eldred sued the state, backed by several major medical organizations, arguing it was unconstitutional to punish her for a symptom of her brain disease that she was physically helpless to avoid.
It was the ultimate test of the "my brain made me do it" defense applied to addiction.
What happened?
The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court firmly rejected her claim. Their decision was heavily supported by addiction experts, including the authors of the very chapter we are discussing today, who argued that while addiction is a formidable condition, addicts retain sufficient choice to be held accountable.
And the clinical evidence supporting that retained capacity for choice is highly robust, isn't it? Behavioral interventions based on consequences are remarkably effective.
They are. Consider contingency management programs, specifically Project Hope Hawaii's Opportunity Probation with Enforcement.
This program dealt with probationers who had long histories of heavy, chronic methamphetamine use. Methamphetamine is notorious for severely impairing cognitive function and executive control.
The program subjected these probationers to frequent, random drug testing. If they tested positive, the consequence was an immediate, brief period of incarceration.
The psychological key to Project Hope was the structure of the sanctions. They were swift, sure, transparent, and fair.
The consequences were not draconian, but they were absolutely guaranteed.
And the results were striking. After 1 year, participants in Project Hope were 55% less likely to be arrested for a new crime and 53% less likely to have their probation revoked compared to a control group undergoing standard probation.
We see parallel success rates in highly educated populations as well.
Like addicted physicians.
Yes. When addicted physicians are identified and monitored by state medical boards, which involves random urine testing and the very real threat of permanently losing their medical license and their livelihood, they demonstrate a 70 to 90% success rate in maintaining employment and sobriety after 5 years.
You cannot offer an Alzheimer's patient a reward to stop their dementia from progressing.
Because the brain tissue is gone.
But you can offer an individual with an addiction a meaningful consequence, and their behavior reliably changes.
And neuroscience itself can actually image the neural correlates of this voluntariness.
Wait, We can see free will on a scan.
In a way, yes. IDA researchers conducted a study where they placed cocaine users and heavy smokers in PET scanners and showed them videos of drug paraphernalia. As expected, the reward circuits lit up.
Right.
However, the researchers then instructed the subjects to actively consider the long-term negative consequences of their habit like lung cancer, prison, or financial ruin, and deliberately attempt to suppress their craving.
And what happened?
When the subjects engaged in this cognitive reappraisal, the scans showed decreased activity in the ventral striatum and increased activity in the prefrontal cortex.
The physiological craving was modulated by conscious, top-down cognitive effort.
Exactly. Voluntariness and neural correlates coexist perfectly.
This research directly challenges the hard determinists, doesn't it? Prominent scientists like the neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky argue that because every human decision is ultimately dictated by a preceding cascade of neuronal circumstances, free will is an illusion.
Sapolsky argues we should abolish the concept of moral blame entirely. In a determinist framework, we should only punish people in a strictly utilitarian way, quarantining dangerous individuals to protect society, but we should never punish them because we believe they deserve it.
But the philosophical counter to hard determinism is compatibilism.
Right. Compatibilists accept that the universe is a causal place governed by physics, but they argue that as long as a person possesses the intact psychological capacity to be guided by reason, to follow rules, and to conform their behavior to social norms, they possess a functional freedom to choose and are therefore morally accountable.
From both a psychological and a societal standpoint, attempting to completely abolish the concepts of blame and retribution is incredibly dangerous.
We need to define retribution carefully here. In a legal context, retribution is not synonymous with bloody, vindictive revenge.
Right. Retribution is the principle of justice based on giving people what they proportionately deserve for their actions.
Why is that psychological framework so necessary for society? To understand the psychological necessity of retribution, we look to the work of sociologist Melvin Lerner in the 1960s.
He developed the belief in a just world hypothesis, didn't he?
He did. He designed a fascinating, albeit distressing, experiment. He had subjects observe a fellow student who was actually an actor receiving seemingly painful electrical shocks during a memory test. One group of observing subjects was given the power to vote to stop the shocks and financially compensate the victim for their suffering. Overwhelmingly, they voted to stop the pain and compensate the victim.
Because human beings possess an innate desire for fairness. When we see an innocent person suffering, our initial impulse is to restore justice.
But Lerner introduced a second condition. Another group of subjects was told they possessed no power whatsoever. They could not stop the shocks, and they could not compensate the victim.
They were forced to sit there and watch an innocent person suffer without any recourse.
Later, when those subjects were asked to evaluate the victim's character, a profound psychological shift occurred.
What happened?
The powerless observers systematically devalued the victim. They rated her as less attractive, less intelligent, and less admirable than the first group did.
They experienced cognitive dissonance. Because they were entirely prevented from restoring justice in the physical world, their brains subconsciously blamed the victim to make the world feel just again.
They rationalized that if she was suffering, she must have possessed some negative trait that meant she deserved it.
And that is the profound social danger of ignoring accountability and retribution. When the legal system fails to impose proportionate, deserved punishment on an offender, the victim feels unavenged, devalued, and dishonored by their own community.
The community itself loses faith in the moral authority of the law.
We see the catastrophic results of this when the law diverges sharply from the community's innate sense of proportional justice. Consider the 1992 acquittal of the police officers who beat Rodney King. Half of Californians surveyed afterwards stated they had lost confidence in the entire court system.
Or consider the widespread outrage following the acquittal in the Casey Anthony trial. When the system fails to hold individuals accountable, the social contract fractures.
Jurors begin nullifying verdicts. Witnesses refuse to cooperate with police. And in the most extreme cases, citizens bypass the law entirely and turn to private vigilantism. Retribution is the psychological glue that holds a cooperative society together.
Which brings us full circle to the core premise of modern clinical psychiatry. Neuroscience is a spectacular revolutionary boon to medicine.
It is helping us map the physical correlates of severe mental illness.
But we cannot allow the allure of neurocentrism to strip away the psychological, social, and moral frameworks that give meaning to human behavior. We are not simply malfunctioning machines.
We are conscious agents, constantly responding to our environment, our internal narratives, our traumas, and the consequences of our choices.
Let's synthesize the key takeaways from today's deep dive into this chapter.
Right. First, neurocentrism profoundly oversimplifies the human experience by attempting to reduce all complex behavior solely to physical brain mechanisms. It misses the poetry by fixating entirely on the ink.
Second, while severe addiction undeniably alters brain circuitry and reward pathways, it does not completely extinguish an individual's self-control or capacity for choice.
This is evidenced by the success of contingency management programs and the epidemiological reality that spontaneous recovery without treatment is the rule, not the exception.
Third, the over-reliance on neuroscientific evidence in the courtroom risks committing the fundamental psycho-legal error, the dangerous mistake of equating a biological cause for an action with a legal excuse for that action.
And finally, human behavior can never be fully explained by a single vector. It must be integrated and understood concurrently within biological, psychological, and social contexts.
To solidify these concepts and test your clinical reasoning, we are going to run through a learning reinforcement with 5 single best answer questions drawn directly from the core themes of the chapter. I will pause briefly after each question to allow you to formulate your answer.
Question 1. What is the philosophical framework most modern psychiatrists use to understand the relationship between the physical brain and the subjective mind, acknowledging that they represent materially identical entities but require different levels of description with completely different emergent properties?
The correct answer is property dualism.
Question 2. What specific statistical phenomenon explains why addiction medicine clinicians might mistakenly view substance dependence as a permanently hopeless chronic condition, while epidemiological data shows high rates of spontaneous recovery?
The answer is the clinician's illusion, which is driven by the availability heuristic. Clinicians primarily encounter the most severe, highly comorbid, relapsing patients, skewing their perception of the broader population of substance users.
Question 3. A patient recovering from severe alcohol use disorder purposefully authorizes their employer to conduct random, unannounced breathalyzer tests. What behavioral economic concept does this proactive environmental management illustrate?
The answer is self-binding.
Question 4. In the context of neurolaw and criminal defense, what constitutes the fundamental psycho-legal error?
The answer is the mistaken belief that simply identifying a biological or genetic cause for a specific behavior automatically means the defendant should be legally excused from responsibility. Lack of rationality is an excuse. Biological causation is not.
Question 5. Why do behavioral interventions like Project Hope succeed in reducing recidivism even among heavy methamphetamine users who present with demonstrably altered frontal lobe circuitry?
The answer is through contingency management. These programs utilize swift, sure, and transparent consequences that successfully leverage the addicted individual's remaining intact capacity for rational choice and consequence evaluation.
Excellent. I strongly encourage you to direct yourself back to Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry to review these specific mechanisms in the text and continue strengthening your clinical reasoning.
And to leave you with a final provocative thought as you head onto the wards, we spent a significant amount of time today discussing how fMRI scans are currently used in the courtroom to argue about intent.
Right. But as we rapidly move into an era of consumer brain-computer interfaces devices where our thoughts can literally type words on a screen or manipulate physical objects in the real world, how will the courtroom of 2050 distinguish between a glitch in the hardware, a software hack, and genuine human intent?
If our mind physically extends into our digital devices, where exactly does our legal responsibility end?
Here are the details of this episode.
PSYCH 053, Neurocentrism, Addiction and the Courtroom.
Byline.
When the brain becomes the explanation, what happens to responsibility?